Hello, Acrylic University members. This is Renee Dorsey. I am married to Jed. If we haven't met, it's because I'm usually working behind the scenes, taking care of a lot of details and organizing things. So I thought I would jump in here today and just record a quick welcome and intro for our guest artist, Samantha. We are so glad you members are here, and we're so glad Samantha is here. She's actually in the chat today, so if you have questions for her, feel free to ask her in the chat, and she's available. She is from Edmonton, Alberta, which also happens to be where I am from, so that is just really fun for me, and I know some of you members are also from that area. We really enjoyed having Samantha as a guest in May. She did a beautiful mountain landscape, and we wanted to invite her back this fall for this Fields and Farm demo. We knew she would do an amazing job again. What I like about Samantha specifically is that she does paint in a more abstract way that we don't usually get to see. Many of our guest artists paint very impressionistically, but not necessarily abstract-y. So I love that. I also love how she uses her palette knife and how she uses different products. Today she'll be using something called fine pumice gel, so I'm very curious about that. She's so good at adding texture and having thick, nice, juicy paint on her canvas. And before we jump in, I just want to make sure you guys know about the masterclass, the Radiant Acrylic Masterclass. It starts on Monday, the 15th. If you haven't registered yet, make sure you do that. The link is in your Tuesday email. Also, reach out to us at support and we can send it to you. It's a really great time to just kickstart painting for yourself. If you're feeling stuck, you just need a little boost. These are really fun events we host a few times a year, and at the end we do open up our membership. So if you know people who are interested in AU, please let them know about it. I'm gonna let Samantha start this demo now. She has an intro and then she'll jump into her painting. So thanks so much for being here.
Welcome to my studio. My name is Samantha Williams-Chapelsky, and I'm an abstract expressionistic landscape painter. Today I'm going to be demonstrating an impressionistic technique using textured acrylics to create a farm and field landscape. I will be using heavy body acrylics along with a product called fine pumice gel to give my work a bit more texture and to add in a matte finish. I will also be using a fan brush, a filbert brush, and a palette knife to give a very interesting dynamic to the overall painting. I hope you enjoy this session. Let's start by talking about the supplies that we will be using during this session. I have a selection of heavy body acrylic paints, as well as a texture medium and a color that we will be using as our base. I have two yellows. I have isoindoline yellow as well as transparent yellow iron oxide. I often find that when I'm painting a lot of space with greens, it's lovely to have two different yellows, one more opaque, one more warm, one more a bit transparent on hand to really vary those greens. I also have two blues. I have phthalo blue green shade as well as ultramarine blue. Again, to help me vary those shades as well as provide a bright, vibrant color for the sky. With acrylics, oftentimes I find our greens are a little bit too vibrant even within this color mixture, so I do keep quinacridone magenta on hand just to tone those greens down. My white for this session will actually be Titan Violet Pale. This is a color I really recommend that if you haven't tried as a white, I really would say it changes your life. It is a really beautiful, warm white with a little bit of that purple tone and really can create some variety in your painting because it does still have that strength of titanium white, just a little bit off in color. Our base panel here has been prepared with a matte acrylic. This is the So Flat acrylic from Golden, and this color is called Red Violet. I put this on top of a pre-gessoed panel just to give me some variety of color underneath, and this will really help unify all those purples and greens that are going to be popping through. My texture product today is going to be fine pumice gel. This is one of my favorite products to use to create minimal texture, and it is one of those products that if you're new to texture, I would recommend the most. It is a gel, so that does mean that our product here will dry semi-clear. So we will get the same sort of effect of our traditional colors with a bit more texture. This does have pumice stone in it, so we do get a bit more volume as well as a really matte finish, which I do really love. For brushes and palette knives, I have 2 brushes here as well as 1 palette knife. I have the Silver Grand Prix extra long filbert. You can see my brushes are very well used. I have the Silverstone fan here as well. This is the size 4 fan and the size 4 filbert. And then I do have a teardrop palette knife. I do prefer these ones in metal, but they are a really great palette knife to be using. And I do always use this one out in the field as well. I have some palette paper as well as my reference image. And then I do have a piece of white Conte. I have this so I can sketch out my image on the purple ground, and it's going to give me great lines and really easy to see. You could also use colored pencil though. Also off camera I have some water and some paper towels. So let's get painting. So my first step is to sketch out my composition. Now today we're going to be using this reference image, which is obviously a very bright canola field, and we do have some buildings in the backdrop here, as well as all of these beautiful clouds. This is a very typical scene in Alberta. In end of July, we tend to get a lot of canola out here. So we're gonna pop in our sketch to get this sort of simplification of this image, which is very complex. Now for me, I always start with the horizon line. So I want to place that in place first. And again, I'm just using my white Conte here to give myself an idea of where that horizon line will be. Now you can see my horizon line is slightly crooked. That's absolutely fine. And that will actually make my composition a little bit more interesting later on. Now with a subject like this, I do want to divide this up into some basic shapes. I often say that 5 to 7 basic shapes is a really great starting point for any painting composition, especially when our tools are slightly larger. So I'm going to start off with this really dark band of stuff going on in the middle here. We do have some barns and some other shapes in here as well. And then I do have another band a little bit brighter, and these do tend to flare a little bit, so I'm going to accentuate that a little bit with my painting. Then I have another band down here. So I've got 1, 2, 3 lines drawn to give me some basic shapes. I'm going to divide up the sky as well, because we do want to have that division of space. And we do want to have some friction points here where our clouds actually go off the canvas. Not everything needs to stay in the canvas constraints. Oftentimes when we have something that goes off the canvas, the painting becomes visually more interesting. I'm going to draw out this negative space here of where the clouds are not, because I think this will really help sort of shape that interior structure. Then we have another one of those over here. And clouds are a little bit wonky shaped, so we can really play with that and use our own artistic interpretation on these. But you can see by just creating a bit of that dimension in the shape structure in here, we'll really start getting a sense of what we're looking at. Now I do want to add in a few of these little farm buildings as well, so I'm just going to structurally lay them out for myself, and that's probably where I will start with my composition. So it's a relatively simple sketch. You could add more if you'd like, so say you wanted to add those fence posts in, you certainly could, but I would stay away from getting super detailed about too much of this, as our texture is really going to help us build up a variety of colors and tones within this space, and of course give us the feeling like we're moving through this textural field of all these different shades of greens and yellows. So I've squeezed out a variety of my colors on my palette here. So I have the phthalo blue green shade, my ultramarine blue, my Titan violet pale, a bit of magenta, and a bit of my transparent iron oxide. Majority of this I'm going to be using in the sky. I have not mixed any of the greens or added any of the extra yellows for the bottom half of the painting yet. I really want to focus on getting the sky in place first, as well as mixing enough paint. So I am going to be using fine pumice gel. This is one of my favorite textures, again, simply because it adds a lot of volume. takes away that acrylic shine, but is borderline transparent. Now we do see that it is a bit of a gray tint to it. This will turn into more of a transparent color once we actually apply it. So I'm going to add a little bit to my palette, a little bit of this to my palette, and I'm going to add this beside each color. I am going to mix my fine pumice gel with every single color that I apply. This will help unify the overall finish of the piece as well, and it'll give me a lot of texture. And I am doing the mixing with my palette knife here. So let's mix up some of this phthalo blue, green shade to start. Now you can see that by adding in the fine pumice gel, we're actually adding a lot more volume as well. So this is a really great cost savings way of saving yourself money, of making more paint by adding in the gels and the paste. The gels and the paste simply extend our paints and add a little bit of a unique finish. Our texture or our pigment can actually be extended a lot into this texture. We can get a lot more paint for our money. So you can see here mixing that ultramarine blue, we have a really beautiful color there, slightly darker than the phthalo blue that's right above it. And I'm just wiping off my palette knife in between each color, especially since I'm going into the white next. I want to try to keep that as clean as possible on my palette paper. They will all get mixed up later on, but we try to start with them nice and clean. Reason why I like the teardrop palettes as well is they keep everything really neat and tidy. They're quite sharp palette knife, so we have the ability to do a lot of mixing on the palette, and then we can really apply very strategically on our panel as well. And again, I'm just wiping off my tool in between each color. Now this is the transparent yellow iron oxide. This is a newer color to my palette, but what I like about it as a yellow is it is a warm yellow, but it is quite transparent, which is really lovely to have because a lot of our yellows are much more opaque. So I'm going to start with the sky portion of this painting, and how I'm going to look at it is I'm going to refer back to my reference photo. And we do have a differentiation between the top part of the sky and this mid part, as well as what would be under here that we can't really see with all of those clouds. We go from a cooler, darker sky to a little bit warmer and lighter color in the middle here. So I'm going to mix a variety of colors together to achieve that. So I'm going to start with my ultramarine blue and my phthalo blue. I'm going to mix these two together to give me my darkest version of the sky. So that will be this top portion right here. And you can see I'm actually just putting that paint right down on the surface. I'm not going to blend it out right now. I'm going to mix a couple of my blues and then I will move the product around after. Now I do want this to be a slightly lighter tone. These two areas are quite a bit lighter. So I'm going to do the same mixture, my ultramarine blue and my phthalo, but I'm going to pick up a bit of my Titan Violet Pale. So the minute we start adding this, everything lightens up. So we can see we've got a much lighter tone here. We're going to pop that in place here and into this area here. And again, I'm just mixing right on my palette paper, scooping up the color and popping it on top there. So now that I've applied these blues, I'm going to mix my color for my clouds. Now these clouds are not white, so we are going to need to do a little bit of mixing ahead of time. We do have this beautiful Titan Violet Pale, which I can just pop some in right into the cloud area. We will also need a bit of gray. So grays are relatively easy to mix with our basic primary palette that we have here. So I'm going to take a little bit more fine pumice gel. I'm going to grab a little bit of my quinacridone magenta and grab some of my ultramarine blue. There is some of my Titan Violet Pale in there as well, and I'm going to make a really nice purple. Now once we hit this sort of purple zone, we can make a gray really easily by just adding a small amount of yellow. And this is a way to really know your colors, know your color mixing abilities, and to challenge yourself to get nice, clean, simple colors from a basic palette. So you can see it's not a very strong yellow, so I'm having to add a little bit more to it to get it to gray out, but I add the least amount of yellow to this product. So you can see there we end up with this really beautiful gray. And I'm gonna pop that basically according to the reference photo that we have here, all along the bases of those clouds to really give me sort of that feeling that the clouds are in space, sort of moving forward. Now, this is an approximate location. We have all of those edges of clouds all throughout here, and we'll talk about simplifying the bottom part here as well, but I'm basically adding all of this in. And we'll probably need a bit more of the Titan Violet Pale mixed in here as well, eventually once we start getting those products moved around. Now that I've got all of that laid out with my palette knife, I'm going to start moving the products around. I'll start with my palette knife and then I will shift to using my brush just to make sure that I've got a variety of marks. I often find having at least 2 different tools in every painting is really important to my style being really interesting and varied when I do different marks. So if I go over, that's absolutely fine. If I go over my lines a little bit, you can see how beautiful and rich that blue is. I'm going to transfer down to that slightly lighter blue area. I'm going to fill all of this in, and I'm basically just filling in the space right now. I'm not doing anything super specific in terms of mark making, and I really want you to keep that in mind as you're painting. We always want to work general to specific, so we never want to do the detailed work first and then have to deal with the rest of the painting that isn't done. We really want to focus on doing the whole painting all at once, sort of at the same level of intensity. Now we are focused on the sky here, but we will transition down to the ground relatively quickly. So again, I'm just moving that product around. This is that Titan Violet Pale. We can see that this is a titanium white. It is covering up that purple, no problem. And I'm basically looking at my photo reference and just sort of copying a little bit of the shape of those clouds. So it's not all of them, but a lot of the big spaces, so the big clouds up top here, and a few of the smaller ones are sort of delineated for myself when I go into this using the brush. So this gets really quite light down here as well, so I want to pop in some lighter tones, and then we can have that gray kind of coming across. Again, that gray transitions up into this whole cloud. This is not all white, it's a lot of that mixture. And let's do the same here. Let's get these nice bright colors right to the top here. And again, just general to specific, really manipulating that texture around first, and then worrying about the mark making the general application after. Moving that gray around all across the bottom. And I do have a bit more blue on the bottom half here. You can see that popping through, and that's actually going to be helpful for me in terms of creating a bit of a different space on the bottom half here. Got a lot of grays in here as well. And you can see we will need some more titanium violet or Titan Violet Pale in here as well. And then I did miss a little bit of my blue, so I'm going to have to mix up a little bit more of my blue here. I think I have some more of that white floating around over here. We'll pop that right in place. The palette paper is getting in the way. So we've added that in. There's a teeny bit of that in there. Now this is the rough looking start. As I said, I will need to add some more Titan Violet Pale. I did not mix enough of that up, so I'm going to mix myself a little bit more just so I have it handy. And now we're going to go into this with the brush. This will help us out a lot in terms of getting some spatial understanding, moving around the paint, and getting a little bit more flow happening. I am going to start with the fan brush. I did soften this a bit in the water, so it's just been sitting in the water for the last few minutes. If you find any of your bristle brushes are a little bit stiff, you can put them in the water for a few minutes before using them, and that will help soften them. Now I'm going to pull my colors together. Obviously sky and clouds, they're not really separate, so we do want to have some sort of interaction between the two colors. We don't want to have that really sharp line between the two. And I am using paper towel still here to wipe off my brush rather than to wash it off. I've talked in the past about having some of that mother color on your brush, so that existing color that is sort of a mixture of everything you've touched so far on your brush to really help unify the whole painting. So it's not a bad thing to just wipe off your brush in the interim rather than trying to clean it every single time. I am starting with just the blues, and I'm really looking at my reference photo here for all of those carve outs, all of those little details that I could add in with the blues. We've got some really great blues over here as well. So I want to try to get in as much of that information with the fan brush that I can. And again, you can see the looseness of my brush strokes here. I'm just kind of dabbing at the paint, not moving it around too much. I just want to make sure that I'm blending a little bit of the colors together. Now I'm going to go into these grays first because these are sort of the bases of all my clouds. This is sort of that underlying cloud base. I'm going to go into here and start adding a little bit of that blue into these guys as well. Again, really looking at those photos or the photo reference and pulling from that as well. And again, just short little dab marks. Again, we're going general to specific. We're not doing a ton of the details yet. We're starting to build up a lot more of them though with those brush marks. And again, really looking at those photos. Where are my grays coming from? Really want to make sure I have an idea of what's happening within this painting in terms of darks versus lights. And again, we don't have a ton of brights in here. We'll add a few extras in when we start adding back in that Titan Violet Pale, but a lot of this is an off-white color anyway, so we want to make sure that we're representing that quite well. And again, just wiping my brush off on paper towels off to the side here. Again, keeping that mother color on the brush. And we have the purple underneath for a few different reasons. Partially what will happen is up here, where a lot more of my color is transparent, we will see that purple popping through, and that will actually help us darken the space. If you're not familiar with acrylics, they do darken as they dry, so we will see a color shift. I will film this painting tomorrow as well, as we're doing our touch-ups, and you'll really see the shift in the colors then as well. Now I've picked up a little bit of that Titan Violet Pale on my brush here. I'm going to carve out a little bit of the highlights into some of these clouds. And you can see just by adding a small amount of highlight, we really start creating this sense of space within the cloud shapes. And again, just wiping off my brush as I go. And you can see all of those beautiful fan brush marks. I do love fan brushes for really getting those loose gestural marks in place. Rather than going straight to something that's a little bit more of a refined brush. We get a little bit more fun happening right off the bat. We're going to go into this bottom area here. This is all really soft. So I'm going to basically blend this all out. This is all sort of that bluey gray that we had. And I'm going to add a few little highlights in here, but they're not going to be really strong highlights. I'm going to really try to blend them into the gray. So they're just like a really subtle variation to that gray. And what I'm doing here, you can see I'm just dabbing up and down, but really blending the color in. And I'm doing strips. So this is where when we look at that photo reference, our clouds are not super defined here. They're actually quite small. There's little pockets of highlights, but there's nothing major for highlights because these are all receding into space. These are the furthest back clouds. So we want to kind of show that these are not right out in front. These are the ones that are a little bit further back. So we can see you've got a nice sort of setup of those clouds. Again, we'll add in a few more highlights here. So going back in with that Titan Violet Pale, carving out a few of my more key highlight areas. They will be mainly in the clouds that are at the front here. These are sort of the biggest, most descriptive clouds that we have. All of the other information is pretty much in the background or in the far back, so don't give it as much relevance. But we'll add in a few highlights to this one, and then we do have quite a bit in this guy as well that got lost there. So we'll add that in as well. Again, I'm just looking at my reference photo, copying some of those bigger areas of color. And this is still relatively loose because we have not gone in here with the filbert brush. This is still a relatively loose application of paint. You can see there's actually quite a bit of paint on the surface though. And what will end up happening is our paint will actually shrink quite a bit once it dries. If you're not familiar, acrylics are actually 50% water. So that 50% water will evaporate and we will end up with 50% less volume. So that means this painting won't be super textured. It will still be textured, but it won't be quite as textured as you think. It might be a little bit softer. Now I do want to get a little bit of a darker gray in here as well. So again, if you'll remember, mixing up that gray, I'm just taking that blue and my magenta, making myself a nice purple. And then we're going to add some white to it eventually here, but first we're going to be picking up that yellow just to tone it down. Now, sometimes with our grays, you'll end up with more of a brown shade. That's fine. That happens often. That just means you went a little heavy on the yellow. So you'll want to turn to the blue to pull it out of there. So the blue will help bring it back to more of that gray tone. And it's always a balancing act with all of these colors. We really play around with that shifting back and forth of the mixture. I find I'm usually adding just the tiniest amount of yellow and then I slowly add a bit more and a bit more and a bit more just to make sure that I'm not overwhelming it and going to that brown right away. Add a little bit more yellow here and we should be at a really nice gray there. So got a little bit more of a purple gray, and I'm actually going to go back in and I'm going to use my filbert brush now. So this filbert is a very well used filbert, and I'm going to mix this and use this right on the bottom edges of some of my clouds. Now this is where we really want to again be referencing that photo. Really want to look at where those edges are, where the darks are in this photo. Because we don't want to really make them super stark. We really want them to have a purpose. So I'm going to go in here, add in, basically I'm picking up paint and just plopping it right on top. I'm not doing a lot of blending here, just adding it right on the surface. And then I can add a little bit into here as well. In this area, I'll probably blend a little bit more as well. You can see by adding in that little bit of tonal variation here, we get just such a beautiful effect happening from that cloudscape. So I'm gonna bring a little bit of this purple up in here. This guy's quite dark in the middle. Same with this one, which is quite a bit darker in the middle here. Try not to have too many areas of really stark clouds. I just don't want to have that much contrast. And we'll talk about focal point in a little bit here, but as you're working on this piece, most likely chance you really want the focus to be mainly on the bottom half of the piece. So keeping the clouds relatively simple and loose is a great way of going. Now again, this is where a variety of brush marks really makes the painting interesting. We start really getting some visual sort of complexities just with the brush marks themselves. So I'm going back in with my filbert, blending in some of the darks that I just put in, really sort of mixing the fan brush marks with the brush marks that I'm doing now, as well as those original palette knife marks, which are still there as well. So again, this is all about sort of that history of mark making and not trying to blend everything together, having each sort of area do its own thing. And I think that's really important. I'm just gonna loosen up this a little bit. This is a little stark down here, so I just wanna lighten up a few of these areas. Again, we don't want a ton of contrast here, but we do want to have a little bit, so it's at least showing that this is still all clouds. And again, I'm just laying a little bit of paint right on top and I'm not really blending it, just kind of plopping those marks down and having them just do their thing. I find oftentimes we like to pet the brush strokes, especially the important ones here. And petting a brush strokes isn't a bad thing, but oftentimes you can get a really heavily blended painting when sometimes those unique one-off brush strokes are actually what makes a painting interesting. So don't be afraid to leave the weird strokes, leave the ones that are kind of, you know, the one stroke wonders that work out really well. Petting the painting doesn't always make it better. So I do call it petting the painting. And we see that a lot in plein air. You have a lot of painters that do the dabby plein air effect. And again, absolutely fine, but it's one of those things where sometimes if we have a more consequential mark or something a little bit more confident, it makes the painting visually a little bit more interesting, in my opinion. Alrighty. So you can see here, I blended a little bit of this section on the bottom here, a little bit looser. We've got our dark sort of shadowy bits right underneath some of those clouds. This guy does have a little bit in here as well. And again, I'm just wiping my tools off on paper towel. I'm not really washing them off at this point. I do want to have some blending of those colors, some of that sort of mother color mixing in here. And then I'm just gonna blend out a little bit of my marks up here and simplify this a little bit. So I'm gonna move on to the bottom half. I will come back to the top just to make sure that it's going to work with the bottom half. We can always paint on top of this as well. So never feel like a painting has to be done at this stage, especially if you're doing top and bottom. You can leave it and come back, and then you're able to do more on top of this, even with a texture product. So I'm ready to do the bottom half of the painting now, and again, like I said, we'll be going back and forth between the two areas. Now this bottom half is a lot more greens, a lot more yellows, and a little bit of that canola color. So I did clean off a bit of my palette to make sure that I can mix really good greens for this area. Now when we start doing this area here, I want to talk briefly about focal point as well as color. For every painting that I do, I like to sort of keep in mind where I want the viewer to focus on, where I'd like them to get to. So when I look at the grand scheme of this painting, I'd like the viewer to end up somewhere over here. What that does is it enables me to get the viewer to a certain point within the piece and be really interested in this area right here. It gives me a little bit of idea in terms of how do I create brush strokes that give us that directional painting, as well as maybe where I want to put some of the details. Now in terms of color, we do know that this area is a lot of green, a lot of yellow. We do want to have our more subtle muted tones in the far back, then our brighter, more vibrant tones right in the foreground. This is the way to make us feel like there's some semblance of perspective here and that we have a differentiation in space. So I'm going to start by mixing up a few of my greens. I have lots of my phthalo blue, yellow shade or green shade, sorry, left. I'm going to grab some of my ultramarine blue here. I've got some of my fine pumice gel mixed out here. I'm going to take a little bit of my ultramarine blue. Now ultramarine blue is a mineral color, so this color typically is a little bit more muted. It will not produce super vibrant greens. So I know that when I add in my transparent yellow iron oxide, I'm going to get a very muted green. It will not be super vibrant, it will be very, very soft. And this will be an ideal green for further back here. The minute I start using my phthalo blue, we're going to get much more vibrant greens. And that's just the nature of phthalo being a modern pigment, so it's a synthetic pigment, meaning it's brighter and it's more transparent. So we do have a little bit of an uphill battle with that one. But we're going to start with ultramarine blue. I am going to grab my isoindoline yellow as well here. We're going to mix another green as well. This one should also be quite muted, but you can see that color itself, a little bit more opaque, a little bit more vibrant here. So we end up with sort of these muddy greens, which is what we're actually looking for. We're not looking for super vibrant greens right off the bat. Now I also have in here a little area of dark, which I'm going to use these colors for, and then a pop of yellow that is backwards here, so it is further back, so it will not be super bright. So I'm going to take a little bit of my isoindoline yellow, and I'm going to mute it with a little bit of the purple that I had on my palette before. This will just soften it a little bit, and then I am going to add some Titan Violet Pale to it, just to make it a little bit more muted with the white. Again, we don't want to have super strong colors in the back here. We want them to be very, very soft. So let's apply some of the colors in here and we'll start getting to work with some of these darker tones. So this is that original ultramarine blue plus a little bit of the yellow iron oxide. I'm just meeting this along the horizon line. So I'm just basically carving this right along that edge there. And then as we come forward, we do have slightly lighter right in this zone here. This is all of our buildings over here. So I'm gonna pop this guy in next. And again, we're doing general to specific, same as we were before. And then we do have a strip that is quite a bit brighter right underneath here. We wanna acknowledge is in there. So these are quite dull colors, and I know it's hard to paint with dull sometimes, but oftentimes it's actually those muddier tones that really can make a painting visually very interesting. And I think it's important to have them on our palette because they are really useful. And I'm going to show you the brighter versions that we're going to add in near the front here, because these are the ones that will really make our painting come to life. So I'm going to be using my transparent yellow iron oxide. This is the more transparent yellow, and I'm going to add in a little bit of the phthalo blue. Now this may be the one that you need to add the magenta to because it might be a little bit unnatural a color. Now I am using a small amount of phthalo blue. You really don't need a lot, and you can even see that was a lot for this color, but it's actually not a bad color. I don't think we'll need a lot of the magenta in here. We'll probably just need it when it comes forward a little bit more. But we can see here we've got a little bit of a brighter color. This is pulling us forward a little bit more of that visual perspective happening here. And that is also because we are using that phthalo blue instead. And again, just popping these colors out, not doing too much interesting stuff to them. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to get it a little bit more vibrant up front here. And I'm going to grab a small amount of the white as well. And this should give us a really nice bright yellow that we're able to pull right to the front. I might have to add in a little bit of this guy. Let's add in a little bit of this as well, just to make sure that we got it nice and bright. You can see here, I'm just varying the color a little bit, trying to get it bright enough so that it's gonna pop out front, not be the same as this one in here. Really want it to stand out. Now we will add a glaze with a little bit more of a variety of colors on top here as well once this is dry. But we're basically just filling in the space right now. Now we do need a dark in here to carve out a little bit more of our space. Now our yellow is extremely warm compared to the yellow in the photo, which is absolutely fine. That's the colors that we're sort of working with right now. But we do need some darks, especially near the bottom of this fence line here. I'm going to add those in just by adding a little bit of ultramarine blue to a pile of the yellows that we already had, just to give it some nice dark tones. And again, I haven't filled in the whole space, haven't done a lot. I'm going to start manipulating the paint now with my brushes, starting the same way that I did up top with the fan brush first. This has been cleaned off, and it's nice and clean for me to be able to use. We will put the buildings in the last little bit here. I try not to worry about them too much because they are such a small portion of this painting. So I'm going to start by blending these. Now you're noticing with this back area, I have gone down to the purple. That's absolutely fine, and what that's going to do is again help me with that implied perspective. It'll help me really get this painting to feel like there are layers to it and to feel like there's a space difference here. And I'm just blending these in with my fan brush here. And again, just wiping off on some paper towel. Now there's still quite a bit of paint here, but I am blending a little bit further down to the surface of the support rather than leaving all of that paint on the surface. I like to sort of blend back and forth a little bit. And again, I'm changing my brush direction a bit here too. I'm not doing as much up and down. This is a little bit more on the horizontal paint application, just to sort of give the idea or the illusion that we're sort of working on a field here. And this is much more opaque in the front, so we've got much more vibrancy happening up here. I am going to wash off my brush just to make sure I get those nice darks in. And even this is reading a little light to me on the bottom, so I may have to go in with a little bit of a darker tone as well. This is still a little bit light for me. Try to get it nice and dark, but we may have to add in the magenta here to actually get the darkness to happen. So just sort of manipulated the paint horizontally. I'm going to go into my filbert. I'm going to create a little bit of a darker tone. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of the phthalo, a little bit of the magenta, a little bit of our yellow. See if we can get a nice dark tone here. I might need a little bit of ultramarine blue too. Add in a little bit of ultramarine blue here, and we'll add it right to the green just to make sure that we're getting it nice and dark. Ultramarine blue is such a great color for getting those darks in place. You find, you know, I don't use blacks. I like to use something a little bit more natural. So getting something like an ultramarine blue on your palette is really helpful, especially for getting those darks in. So we have these little bit of striations happening here. They are in the photo reference that I'm looking at. And then we have a few sort of in the middle here. Again, I'm just layering the paint on top. I'm not really blending that area in. And then this is quite dark over here. We have a little bit of a highlight over here as well that we'll have to get in. And we haven't added a lot of the brighter highlights. We're kind of sitting mid-tone right now. But I'm going to go in here and I'm going to change the direction of some of my marks, and I'll use my palette knife as well. But what I find is, because we're dealing with crops and we're dealing with fields, we don't want to have all horizontals. We want to have some different marks happening. So I find if we start thinking about these as individual areas of crops and we change our palette knife marks or our brush marks to different areas, we can get some really interesting effects. So I'm going to take my brush, go back in here and start varying my brush marks a little bit. I'm going up and down in here with my filbert. Add a little bit of that brightness in here. We talked earlier about making this area over here more the focal point. So I'm adding a little highlight into there, a little highlight behind there as well. You can see by just varying that brush mark to up and down versus horizontal, we do have a little bit more visual interest happening from this area because we've changed the direction of the marks. And we want to do that in a few different areas, and we want to sort of do this in terms of, implied perspective, so that our focal point, or our perspective lines would actually go to about here. So everything disappears, our vanishing point, at that line. So you can sort of see what I'm doing here. I'm dragging my brush down, everything is going to that line. And that's sort of giving me my fake perspective, I should say, my implied perspective. It's just helping me get the idea that this is moving in space. There's a difference between the far back and the foreground here. Now you can see we've got some nice bright areas right in the foreground here, right at the bottom. So I do want to put those in place as well. So let's bring that in, bring in some really nice brights right on the bottom. Again, I'm going to go a little bit more of that vertical mark because we're pulling us forward a bit. And this still needs to go a little bit darker. So if I can get this darker by adding in a bit of magenta to the pile of blue, that would be ideal. If I'm getting darks dark enough, sometimes can be the challenging part in a painting because we're not dealing with something that is, we've got some borderline opaque colors. We just want to make sure that we're getting dark enough. And like I said, I'll be filming this tomorrow as well, so we'll be able to see if we're really achieving that once this dries, because we do have a little bit of a shift in terms of color here. Now I've got a lot of that beautiful purple underneath. I can use that to my benefit as well. We talked a little bit about that horizon line vanishing point. We can always carve back in some of these lines as well. These can be a little bit sharper in some areas. Sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of a sharper line. And if you don't like any of these, you can always take them out. You can brush them back out. It's never a problem. But again, you can see I'm varying my marks, which is sometimes a good way to challenge yourself to trying something new, adding in that new tool, just to give yourself a bit of variety. And again, I do need to give myself some highlights into this bottom part, and then of course, sort of match the bottom to the top, so we do want to add in a little bit of back and forth there. But we are getting there. Blend this a little bit. And this actually goes down. Do have some darks that go a little bit further down. So I want to make sure I'm carving these out right. And then there's quite a bit of dark right along here. This is again our fence post line. So if you have those fence posts in place, be a good time to get your fence posts in just so you can see how dark to make that area. Again, I like to add in different layers as I'm going. And we definitely still need that highlight, and we need to add in our little buildings. Highlight, obviously we're going to need some of our white in here. So I'm going to grab some of our Titan Violet Pale, a little bit more of our fine pumice gel. Now our highlight, let's start with that. Let's mix in a bit of our yellows. We really want to make sure that we're not too far off of our yellows. We want it to be somewhat close, but we certainly want it to be brighter. So let's bring in a little bit of our highlight here. And again, this can help us, again, pull the viewer to our focal point, help us sort of create the space. Now, if you really wanted that canola color, you can add in a color like cadmium yellow light or cadmium yellow lemon. That's a great color as well, and that will be more true to canola. For me, I find that canola color a little jarring sometimes, so I like to vary it a little bit if I can and give you sort of the sense that these are different fields. Obviously, we still have that nice bright yellow, but we've got a variety of colors popping through. I lost a few of my lines there, but that's okay. I'll put them back in. I'm going to go back into my filbert here. I'm going to try to get that focal point to sort of pop. So I'm going to use that little bit of highlight that I had. I'm going to pop that in place. Try to pull the eye to that area. And again, these are soft lines. They don't necessarily represent anything, but we're going to try to get the sense that this is a field, it's moving in space. Maybe those wheat stalks are moving or the canola stalks are moving in the wind. So kind of have this different reflection of light as it's sort of shifting around. Then we'll need a little bit of a highlight in our green here. So let's make a little bit of that nice green tone. A little bit of a highlight in here. And again, it's not necessarily the beautiful colors that make this interesting. Oftentimes it's the wonky ones that we're adding in that kind of give us the most visual interest. I like sort of playing around with color relationships and color theory and seeing how we can create implied perspective without really sort of drawing the viewer in. Just by use of like crazy vibrant colors, can we make them a little bit more simplified? We're going to grab a little bit more of that Isolindoline yellow and see if I can pull a little bit of this forward. I just mix the smallest amount of white with this guy. Just pull this right forward here. Make sure that we're reading this in terms of perspective wise, what's happening, that this is foreground, this is sort of midground, and that would be the background. Again, you've seen that I've done the least amount of work on that back area there, mostly because that's the least amount of information that I can see. So if we sort of treat everything that's in the background like what we can visually see, we'll have a better sense of how to move through the space. Now I do have all these nice little buildings in here. I will use the white for that, so the Titan Violet Pale, but I'm going to tint it just off a little bit so that it's not pure white. It will be a little bit too stark if we did that. So I'm going to grab a teeny bit of the blue just to have it off white. Now these little buildings kind of have like a little shed here. There's another one right beside it. Another guy right there. And they do have an underlying color. They're a little bit darker underneath, so we'll add in a bit of a darker tone. So let's maybe mix up a dark purple. Pop that right underneath. And again, you can see that that is simplicity in making buildings work. You can add obviously more details. You could go into this more detail, but I'm using such big tools that I don't want to make it all about the buildings. I want the whole thing to sort of feel cohesive. So if I brought out my teeny tiny little brushes, it wouldn't feel the same as if I'm doing this painting with sort of the same texture marks all over, the same brush mark applications, just to really make it feel like it has that life to it. Let's make those pop a little bit more. We'll add a little bit of pink in there. The light blue, and again, I'm just using the same big brush, a little bit more controlled. We've had a lot of coffee today. Might be a challenge for you, and that's okay. I do that often. Now we're gonna look at that cloudscape up above, and let's see if we need to do some changes up there. I wouldn't mind having a little bit of the yellow tones in here as well, especially on the cloud ridges. So I wouldn't mind having a bit of that yellow pop onto the clouds. So let's see if we can make that happen. And this is where those really ugly colors come into play. Again, I'm just using what's left on my palette, and I'm just gonna see if I can pull a little bit of that yellow tone into here where it's a little bit of a nod to what's below that's actually in those clouds. And again, it's just a little bit of a warmer tone because there's so much yellow in the landscape. Of course, that's going to reflect up onto the clouds themselves. So you don't want to have that completely separate. I want to make sure they somehow connect one way or another. So I'm just adding in a little bit of that dirty grayed out yellow right in here, and mix the yellow with the purple that was on my palette there. Give that cloud a bit of a tail. And again, you can see just by adding in a little bit of that warmth, get a little bit more connection to the ground below. Now, oftentimes you'll see a lot of artists will do sort of more of a turquoisey tone near the very horizon line of a painting. And this might be a good place to add that little bit of like greenish blue into your work. If you haven't tried that before, it's a kind of an interesting concept of adding in something a little bit warm right to the horizon line of your painting. It's still a blue, but it's going to have a little bit of that yellow tint to it. So you can see here, a little bit more of that yellow, adding a little bit of that sort of turquoise tone right along that horizon line. It doesn't need to be all over. It can be in little bits here and there. Just really sort of grounds the whole piece and makes you feel like, again, you're moving through this space in terms of perspective. It's giving you some visual sort of difference between the two spaces. Again, just playing around with a little bit of the blending of the clouds. I don't want to do too much here. Again, over blending is a thing, but want to get it to a point that we're happy with it. And then of course we're going to come back once it's dry, and we're going to add in a few more details to it. Now before I go to let it dry, I'm going to add in a few more highlights into the clouds and a little bit more of that purple tone. So if you lost your purple tone, remember that purple was just a mixture of our primaries plus a little bit of yellow. I'm going back in with that just to give it a little bit of variety here. I find sometimes you can't see all the bits until you sort of move away from them. Also, I'm trying to give my clouds a bit more of a shape to them and simplify a few big chunks of space. I don't want them to all feel like they're tons of little brush marks. I want them to feel a little bit more cohesive. I'm gonna grab that. Now we do have a lot of that purple showing through right at that horizon line, which is going to be really lovely to see that once it dries. That's going to really help ground us with this painting, and it'll give us a lot more sort of visual understanding that this is the horizon line, this is further back versus coming forward. So making sure that you have that sort of little bit of purple showing through, not a bad thing. Now I'm just going back in, I'm adding in those highlights like I said. We do have a little bit of a highlight on the bottom edge of some of our clouds as well. So don't be afraid to add in some highlights even if they're on the cloud shelf. That is fine. Sometimes they have a little bit of a highlight underneath. Not a bad thing. Again, I'm just using my filbert for the last touches here before we let this dry. We come back to see what it looks like once it's dry. Acrylics shift a lot once they dry, and especially because these are quite matte, we'll be able to really see that effect of the texture as well as the final colors, because I do find we have that really strong shift. It's hard to know what we're sort of working with. So once we let this dry, probably about 24 hours depending on your humidity level. If you are in a space that is extremely humid, you might have up to about a week for this to actually dry. It is sort of the nature of acrylics, they dry by evaporation, so we might need a bit more time depending on your location. But I'm going to give mine a day. I'm in quite a dry climate, and then I'll come back and see if they need to have any touch-ups to add in a little bit more texture here and there. And again, remember, you can layer and layer and layer. There's no end to how much layering you can do with your acrylics. And that's sort of the best part. So just stay tuned and we'll come back and we're going to finish up the little bottom edge as well tomorrow once all of this dark has dried up. So now that our painting is dry and we've had about 24 hours for this piece to completely flatten out and have that matte finish, again, very dependent on your humidity, we can see that some of our colors have dried a bit darker. So this area here is an area that I'd probably like to brighten up just in order to push it backwards to make this feel a little bit more like there is some implied perspective. You can definitely see that the fine pumice gel does give this overall a very matte finish, very similar to what an oil painting would look like, which I do love the effect of the fine pumice gel and how it can really change the nature of what acrylic looks like. So I'm going to grab a little bit more fine pumice gel here. Now this is all dry to the touch. Best way to tell if your acrylic painting is dry is just to put your hand on top. And I'm going to mix up a slightly lighter version of this green. We did use a lot of that dark purple underneath, so that is what is influencing our dark here. So we're going to mix up something slightly lighter, meaning that we will use a little bit more of our Titan Violet Pale. I've got some ultramarine blue out as well, and then I'm going to pull out our transparent yellow oxide. And I'm going to mix these together. Now I don't need a very strong color, I'd actually like it to be a little bit softer. Because we do want this to read lighter, but we do want it to be quite cool. The coolness will help us push that area back and sort of recede into space. And I'm going to add a little bit of the white just to ensure that we've got that coverage. And again, I'm going right over top of the dry paint. Best part about acrylics is you can always layer. So again, we're just going to push that back a little bit. Then as I bring it forward, I'm going to warm it up a small amount more with just a touch more of that yellow, just to make sure there's again that variation in here. And we have a lot of that deep purple that's underneath influencing this part of the painting, which I really do love. So making sure that we're leaving little gaps, a little bit showing through is absolutely fine. And then our last little area to lighten up right over here. Again, we'll go a little bit stronger with the color. Not quite as dark as it is. We do want it to be slightly lighter than what it is right now. And again, we don't have to cover the whole thing. We can just sort of dot that along the horizon line. And then I do want to go back into my sky, brighten that up on the bottom horizon line there, and then we'll touch up this bottom area. Now, if you remember our sky, we put in sort of a turquoise tone right at the bottom. I am going to add a little bit of my phthalo blue onto the palette as well, just to get that nice bright blue popping through. So let's grab some of our phthalo blue. We've got our ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, and our Titan violet pale. And we do want that to be a little bit on the turquoisey side, so we are going to add in a little bit of that transparent yellow oxide just to lighten it up. We're just going to add a little bit more of that brightness right to this horizon line. And I do have this one little dark area in here. I'm just leaving that for now to see if I need to lighten that or if I can leave that and have that sort of become a structure in this space. I'm just going back into some of my little sky areas here, sort of like you paint the tree holes. We're also painting sky holes here. We're just having these lighten up a little bit, especially closer to that horizon line. Helps us really delineate that space in that our clouds are sort of rolling into the back here. Go all the way up here a little bit. Maybe we'll add a little bit more blue into that. And you can see here, just by changing that tone just a little bit, we start really sort of drawing our eye further and further back. We have that separation of space. I'm bringing a little bit more of that up here as well. And again, I'm using my filbert. I'm using it like a small brush, but I haven't really switched into a super small brush. I find more impressionistic methods of painting will have you sort of using more of those mark making tools. So the tools that will give you more distinct marks, which I find these filberts really do have the ability to give you such a direct painterly application. You can obviously go in here with smaller brushes and really sort of smooth that out, blend to your heart's content. I love the brush marks personally, so that's more my sort of in line with my style. So got that sort of area settled. I do think this needs to be lighter back here, so we are gonna go back in, lighten that guy up a little bit more. So we've got our same colors that we were using before, but let's make it even lighter here. Just to make sure that that is really pushed back. So you don't want it popping forward, which it still is. Make sure it's nice and light. Slightly more on that blue tone. And then we have that little bit of hillside or whatever we want to call that. And we've got that little pop happening right there. Now we're going to brighten up this foreground. Obviously we want this to really be punchy. And again, remember our focal point is somewhere over here. So I'm going to grab some of my fine pumice, a little bit of my white, so that Titan violet pale. And I'm going to grab the stronger yellow, which is our isoindoline yellow. I'm going to mix that in as well. A little bit of our other yellow just to tone down that brightness. I do have some water on my brush here as well, so we got a little bit of a blue tint happening. But I want to bring this down a little bit just so that it's not so perfectly exact that we have this distance between the dark all the same on the bottom. I want to have it a little offset, so if I can brighten this up, pull this all the way down, that we have it a little bit more offset and it's a little brighter right near this sort of foreground area, so we're really popping forward. This would also be a really great place if you wanted to add in those fence posts. That would be absolutely beautiful here. I'm going to go in here. Now we have so many little grasses, we have so many little detail things here. I don't really have that much detail in this painting, but I wanted to feel like there's something. So I'm going to pick up a bit of that color, I'm just going to lay it on and loosely abstract in some grasses. Alrighty. And again, we can see that we're just sort of brightening up this foreground. We're sort of pulling our eye over to this direction here. And our last little chunk is going to be just brightening up that little area underneath those buildings. That's more of our focal point. So I'm going to mix up a little bit more of this creamy sort of tone here. I'm just going to make sure this is nice and clean. Brighten this guy up right here, just so that we know what we really want the viewer to look at. We want to direct the eye to it, so making sure that all of our lines are sort of saying head this direction. And this is the point that I would say, if you want to finesse, if you want to play with anything else, just be careful of overdoing it. And that's always the case with more impressionistic paintings. It's really easy to keep on going, keep on playing, keep on having fun, but there is a point that we really want to let those brush marks that were originally put down sort of do their magic. And that's the fun part of painting this way, is that we're really able to let our brush marks show, let them sort of sing and showcase what we can do with the brush. I am going to add a small amount of blue in here just to reflect a little bit of that shadow that's coming from the sky. And you can see that little bit of blue just pops this forward a little bit more, but again, it's still recognizably a shadow. And I think with that, we'll probably let this dry. Now, one of the things that I always like to mention as well is that a painting will look very different framed versus unframed. So as you get to finishing your pieces, it's important to have around something like a really easy frame to pop your painting into, just to see what it would look like if you were to frame it up. I find that framing pieces can often give us a really beautiful way of looking at them and enjoy them a little bit further away and see what they actually look like framed up. So that is the finished piece, and we'll let this dry. We'll end up with that really beautiful satin finish. And of course, once it's fully dry, you can choose to varnish. You don't have to. We've used all archival products here today, so this painting will have no color change for over 100 years if you follow the colors that I have recommended. So a very lovely color palette with this one. Thank you for tuning in for my session using an impressionistic approach to creating a landscape with farm and field. I hope you enjoyed learning all of my different techniques for applying paint and adding texture. To follow my journey as an artist, visit me on Instagram at Samantha Williams-Chapelsky or through my website at samanthawilliamschapelsky.com. I hope to see you again.